introduction. Who wants to tell Pete that no one uses Snapchat anymore? Sorry to bear the bad news. All right.
Save me the time and effort.
I have a few things that I want to talk to you about here tonight to kick off this Women in Economics Week. I'm very honored to have been invited to come here and spend some time with all of you. So please, any of you who have an interest in getting a PhD, who would like to learn more about the Mercatus Center, who want to talk more about women's rights and institutional economics, find time with me. I'd love to chat. So there are three things that I want to go over in the relatively limited amount of time we have here today. The first, I want to offer just a brief definition of what economic rights are. And I know this is something that many of you may be familiar with, so I won't spend a huge amount of time with it, but I just want to begin by getting all on the same page. And then this is maybe the most fun part in my mind, looking back at our own history within the United States. How is it that women's economic rights changed? We live in a very different world for women today than we did in 1800. And I think that's a fun and a weird history sometimes, but also important to keep in mind. And then I want to conclude and use whatever time we have at the end to talk a little bit about what we can learn from this history that might help others. So even though the women is in the title of this talk, it's not really just about women. This is about understanding how it is that a group of people who are in a situation where they are being denied rights, where they are living under what we would call oppression within a political system, where you have a curtailed level of rights and freedoms compared to other people living in your same society. How is it that those groups interact with the market, and how is it the interactions with the market wind up changing their circumstances and creating opportunities for them to change their own circumstances? So it's much more generalizable than just women's history per se. All right. So what are economic rights? And the definition that I would like to suggest here is that your economic rights are your abilities respected by the society you live in to make your own decisions about what you will do with your time and resources. So, time really is just a resource. I pull it out and kind of separate because I think it's critically important. So we are talking about physical resources like land, like the wealth that you hold, but really some of the most important resources you have at your disposal are how are you going to spend the scarce hours of your life. So economic rights are also in part, can you choose to do things like where you want to live, where you want to work, what kind of productive enterprises you want to become involved in. Can you get into business? Can you not get into business? Can you become educated? If so, what are you allowed to learn? What areas are you able to study? So if you're the one making those decisions, then you are planning your own life. So you have this scarce set of resources available to you. You don't get, of course you can change at any time for your life, but you don't get that many opportunities to decide how you're going to invest this gift that you've been given of being one of the people who gets to populate the planet. So being able to plan your own life, this is what we're really talking about when we're talking about people being free to make their own economic decisions, their own buy and sell and investment decisions within the marketplace. Because again, we're not talking just narrowly about the money, but also about your own personal actions. And so just a little quote from Hayek here. I am in the Hayek program, so I can't miss an opportunity. I think I probably have to go sit in the stockade if I do. Coercion occurs when one man's actions are made to serve another man's will. And so there's a real sense in which, in not just American history, but in the history of civilizations around the globe, institutions have developed within which women were subject to coercion that their male counterparts were not subject to. So the term for this that you might have heard in other contexts is patriarchy. So patriarchal institutions are a set of legal and property institutions within which men are making decisions that are deciding what's going to happen with women's resources. So these gendered property institutions where the power is being given to men. So patriarchy is not just like a feminist buzzword. It's an actual real legal thing, and there are legal institutions, including within our own history, that have been patriarchal in nature and are best defined that way. And so the change in these institutions is in large part what we're trying to understand when we want to look at the history of women's economic rights. So this gentleman, who is not only clearly my hair inspiration, also one of the eminent legal scholars of the 18th century, is Sir William Blackstone. And his treatise would have been the most common legal text to be found in the United States immediately following the founding of this country, when all of the states were writing their state legal codes and constitutions as they came into existence. So here's what Blackstone says. The very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage. So what this means is that from the perspective of any court, any lawyer, any trustee reviewing something like a will, that you don't actually count, if you're a married woman, as a separate person. Your entire legal identity is rolled up into that of your husband, under whose wing, protection, and cover she performs everything. So just to specify that list out a little bit, if husband and wife are legally one person, this means that married women can't own independent land, homes, and businesses. So this is why most of the female-operated businesses in the late 18th and early 19th century were operated by widows, because you did get to keep some of the property if your husband died. But as long as you were married, it was his property. You can't keep wages separately from that household pot. You can't sign contracts, you can't represent yourself in court. If you do need to have a legal suit adjudicated, you have to find what is called a next friend, which is basically just any man who can represent you is allowed to legally come into the court, but you can't represent yourself. And you can't write a will. So being able to pass what you have accumulated and developed during your life onto your children is, of course, acknowledged today as a critical motivation that might drive someone to really build a business or to save or to try to create a better life. And wives are not legally permitted to assign property through this process. It has to all be allocated through their husband's will, which means that he is the primary and the only legally recognized decider. So you take this confining set of circumstances where once you get married, you give up all of this independent economic decision-making ability. You give that to your husband, and if he's a jerk about it, you can't get out. Because at this time in American history, it's also almost impossible to get a divorce. So nobody could get divorced at all in South Carolina until 1869. So this is a huge part of American history where it's impossible to get away. And since most women's work at this time is taking place within domestic settings, it also makes it harder for them to just escape. So men have a lot more opportunities to just kind of disappear in the night, and now I'm living with a family in a different state, or I've joined the military, or there are a lot of other ways to get out. But women are legally not permitted to divorce, and with the exception that you can seek a divorce if you've been abandoned for 7 years. So you have to wait until you've been 7 years without your formal economic rights, and then you can sue for a divorce. So kind of a big motivating question behind this research and why I got so invested in looking at this subject is trying to understand how did so much change. So we went from a circumstance that, at least according to the letter of the law, should have been debilitating and had been almost universal throughout most of human history since the very first nation states. And there's a historian named Gerda Lerner who does this fascinating work where she looks at, in early nation states, warfare between different factions would result in the male captors being executed and the women becoming enslaved. And so she writes this as a history of where we can trace to those early military conflicts both the birth of slavery as an institution and patriarchy as an institutional practice. So it's really interesting research if you are interested in going deeper into this stuff. But in trying to understand, I guess, the positive side of that, and to put a more optimistic spin on it, is that even though these kinds of institutions that deprived, or at least had potential to deprive society of women's contributions as the economy began to grow, we had this window where almost everything changed. So none of these legal disabilities exist anymore. Some of them lasted a little later in history than you might think. It wasn't until the 1970s that it became unconstitutional to discriminate against women in labor law. That labor law was kind of the last vestige of laws that applied to only one gender rather than another in the United States. So it hasn't been all gone as long as you might think. But by and large, during the 19th century, there was about a 60-70 year window where this, grand history that had existed for so long was cleaned away. And so how did that happen? I want to give 3 suggestions. And the first is that new opportunities for women to work outside the home resulted in them gaining respect, skills, and influence. And then kind of the second stage of this is that increased respect, skills, and influence translated both into a continuing increase in opportunities that were available to them and also political change. So they became really capable of being influential in terms of pushing for change in the law. Okay, so in 1800, the United States was 90 to 95% agrarian. So everybody was farming. And what the work that was primarily undertaken by women in the household was not just kind of the cooking and cleaning picture that we had in mind, but it was also a large part of the gardening, growing vegetables for household consumption, raising poultry, breeding poultry, producing any kind of preserved goods. I have this little cookbook, one of the first published in the United States. It was published in 1796. And at that time, cooking included gardening, so there are the gardening instructions. There's also the instructions on how to properly get meat. So one of the tips in this cookbook is to not buy veal if it's been transported to the market on a sweaty horse. Because veal is a sensitive meat, and apparently the sweaty horse will ruin its quality. So we're talking about an enormous amount of hard labor, and labor that we would think of today as being kind of very ugly and challenging. This was a hard job being a woman farmer. And one of the jobs that was involved, in addition to producing all of the foodstuffs and farming and candles and what there existed of medicines, was creating clothing, which often started with wool. So before industrialization, the process of producing cloth looked something like this. There'd be one woman or a small group of women working within a home. And the woman on the left-hand side here is she's taken, you can see on the right side of the picture here, where she's spinning the wool, and then she's carding it. That's the second step, to take that wool into string. And then this woman over here on the right is operating a rudimentary loom. So you can see this object she's holding right here is a shuttle. There's a thread in that shuttle that's going to lay all of the horizontal fibers in the fabric. All of the vertical fibers, you can't see them in the painting, but they're stretched vertically along the loom. And she's arranged all those vertical fibers ahead of time and is now throwing that shuttle through. So we're talking about a job that, like, look at the threads in the clothing you're wearing. So the clothing you're wearing is much finer than anything that people would have been able to have access to at this period in time. So the weaving would not have been quite as fine here. But every single thread is a woman physically throwing this shuttle from one side to the other. So it just takes forever. It's grueling manual labor. This is what making cloth looks like after industrialization. And this tool here on the right, this loom, is fundamentally the same piece of technology as we see in this painting. The primary difference is it's now operated by water and steam power as an adjunct to muscle power. So originally it was purely muscle power. So what this means is that when the first of these machines, so all these machines are connected to a crankshaft in the ceiling that turns, and the energy for that turning is generated by either the water or the steam engine. And what this means is that one woman can operate 4 of these looms, and she quadruples her productivity. So the amount of cloth that it would have taken 1 hour to make through the home method, the amount of cloth that would take 1 hour to make through this new industrialized method would have taken 4 hours to make if she was sitting by herself at home. That's the very first of these. And the technology only grew from there. So what does this mean when you now quadruple your productivity? You're now valuable to the labor market and to these employers in a way that you weren't before. So, I mean, many of you are kind of yet to enter the full-time workforce, but when you do, you'll find that the most valuable asset you can possibly have, and the thing that's going to bring you the most bank at the end of the day, is that a lot of people want your skills. You need people from many different kind of areas of the economy or different companies or organizations to be competing for you. And that's what actually brings the benefits to you as a worker. If you have good enough alternatives, that if your current job is not working out for you, say because it involves having to do all this animal slaughter and worry about horse sweat and things like that, if that's not working for you, and you have another alternative, you can say, okay, shove it. I'm going to stop doing this stupid first job that I was doing before, and I'm going to move into a preferred alternative. If that alternative doesn't exist, you can't make that move. You can't make that move. So the ability to exit into another alternative in the labor market is going to be kind of critical to you being able to increase the quality of your life, for that economic decision making to really be meaningful in changing the quality of your days and your circumstances. So, okay. So, what was life like for the women who went to work in these first textile factories? It was largely women. It wasn't until decently into the 20th century that it was common for men and women to work the same jobs in the same places. Almost every task or job was kind of a man's job or a woman's job. And so the women who worked operating the looms in these textile factories, they were usually about your age. They were between 16 and 24. They would usually work for about 4 or 5 years, save up money, and then at that point, either get married and start a family, or maybe go on to becoming a matron of the boarding house or something like that. But these women, these young women, they, by moving to the mills, were able to take advantage of not just an unprecedented economic opportunity, but also an unprecedented educational and social opportunity. So in addition to the labor and the work being really hard, one of the other tough things about being a farmer at this moment in history is that land is not as productive as it can be with the technologies we have today, which means that farms are very spread apart, which means that you just don't meet all that many other people, possibly in your life. So this idea of moving to the city to have either just for work or to have a life-changing experience like we do today, I'm gonna, feeling motivated, I'm gonna completely change my life, I'm gonna take on a new challenge, I'm gonna move to San Francisco, I'm gonna move to New York. These kind of things, they don't so much exist prior to industrialization. But once factories congregate in cities, originally because that's where the water source is for the water power. And so going to work at these factories means you also get to go to the city. You get to meet a lot of other young people, because other young people are coming there too. So you get a much wider range of people to interact with socially. And also these mills put on classes. So they put on classes for women to attend in the evenings. This picture here on your left is the cover of a magazine that is written, edited, and published exclusively by the women who work in these mills. So this was really an opportunity that when it first emerged was something that entrepreneurial, bright women who previously had no alternative but to work on the farm, either their father's farm or their husband's farm, were now moving to the city and taking advantage of this new opportunity. So they share the word, they send word back to their family members and to other people in their communities. There are people who are hired by the mills to go out and travel the country and the countryside to recruit women to come and work in the factories. So through this process of industrialization, women's labor now becomes valuable in a way that had previously not been predicted. And this expanded set of opportunities is something that women need to be educated on. And it takes an entrepreneurial spirit for the first ones to really take advantage of it. But you see women who, they see this sign up. 75 young women wanted to work in the cotton mills in Lowell and Chicopee, Massachusetts. Agent for procuring help for the mills, I am Boynton. And now here's a letter from one of the women who attended one of those meetings and decided as a result to go work in the textile mill. So this is Arilla. She lives in upstate New York. And she says, let anyone have told me 3 weeks before I came here that I should ever work in a Lowell factory. I should have ridiculed the idea at once. But they are building new factories, and they sent out a man to get girls to work in. He came to York State and picked up girls, at least 72 in number. They did not all come at the same time that I came. There were only 18. But they all came this spring, and who wonders if I did get the Lowell fever? She means typhoid. So I'm not trying to pretend like, these early urban and industrial environments were perfect. Early cities were hotbeds for a disease because you had close populations living together, which creates a lot of potential for spread and contagion and unsanitary conditions, because we're talking about before indoor plumbing. But even facing all those costs, she still finds the trip to Lowell such a remarkable opportunity. And one of the reasons, and her letter continues, that her friend Harriet is teaching. So one of the, a common work opportunity available to women prior to this would have been to teach for a short period of time before they got married. It's not until the 1950s or 60s that unless you're very poor, it's considered common and normal to continue to work after you get married. So this is like a relatively late change in American history. But so Harriet's teaching that she could only get $1.25 a week, and she thought she'd spent way too much time and effort to teach for that, so she resolved them to show them a Yankee trick and went to Lowell. So she concludes her letter by saying, I guess you and Harriet had better come to Lowell and get rich with the rest of the 16,000 girls here. So the thing that I find remarkable about this is that it's this entirely new slate of economic opportunities and ways to invest their time and energy that is being created for these women. And as a result of that, they are able to exert an independence that they had previously not known, and that would have not existed with this technological development. So I think we hear a lot about technological development, the job loss that can come along with it. You know, that's a conversation right now in 2020, as it always is in election years. You know, the cities that are maybe, you know, a factory is shutting down, and, you know, different people depending on their analysis, or sometimes depending on their agenda, will want to attribute that to either trade or to technological progress. But kind of this flip side of technological progress is that, well, the jobs have been lost over here when this factory closed. Over here, a new set of opportunities has emerged for a different set of people. And sometimes that different set of people is a group that has been kind of left out of the labor market and left out of the best jobs in the past. And why is it so likely to be that group that's been left out? Because they're cheaper. So, you know, you think the wage gap is bad today, or was bad in the 1980s? In 1820, women made 30 cents on the dollar. So, but the advantage of that position is that when you are the cheap labor source, you get to be the first one kind of into that new industry that's now coming around through technological change. So the progress of technology and the changes that are created kind of enable this churning that make it so that it's not always the same people who are in the most advantageous positions. So I think it really is an important and I think under-recognized flip side of that technological progress story. It's so much easier sometimes, especially when you're in the moment, to understand the costs than to understand the opportunities that are being created that maybe haven't been fully realized yet. Okay. So this is, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but this is a map of the United States. The darker the shading is on the state, the earlier that state enacted protections that enabled married women to hold property independently and to be able to keep any earnings they acquired by working a job. So basically we're talking about economic reform for women. And if you look at the northeastern corner of the United States, the shading is much darker up here on this corner of the map because this is where the industrialization was taking place. The slave economy held the South back from this industrialization. It held it back from this progress that created these new opportunities for women. So because in part of the exploitation of other members of the labor force that was happening in the South wound up being a place that was that held less opportunity for women as well. The other thing to notice about this map is that as we travel across the western United States, there's this path through the middle of the country where we see more liberalization happening than we do to the north and to the south. And this path is essentially where the first transcontinental railroad went, which leads me directly into my next point, which is that if you can move around and you can easily choose to live in a different state and to live under a different set of laws, it makes it easier for you to get out from a bad political regime, and it also puts pressure on the state you left to reform. So the ability to choose which kind of law you're going to be governed by, which is made possible only in areas of law that are decentralized, encourages reform. So there are a few conditions that have to hold for this to work. The first is that people must have autonomy over where they are going to live. So people have to be able to choose for themselves. In the United States, this is facilitated by the fact that you have the ability to freely migrate across state borders. So laws about women's property are established at the state level, and there's absolutely nothing that stops you from moving into a different state to live under a set of laws that is going to be better for women. Jurisdictions also have to be able to choose. So if there is, say, federal regulation that prohibits states from enacting a different set of laws or defines what the law has to say in a particular area, then you're going to get a lot less competition. But when these two things come together, when you have choice in the creation of law and also choice in the consumption of law, new institutional alternatives can emerge. And you get this opportunity to move into a completely different community and a completely different way of life. So when you go to the archives and look at what's happening in the conversation around women's economic rights in the late 19th century, there's a lot of really interesting and cool stuff. And one is that we explicitly see that not just early corporations were competing for women, but states and territories were also competing for women and to bring women into their jurisdictions. So this is J.M. Ashley on your left. He was the governor of the territory of Montana at the time he made this statement. It says, here in Montana there is remunerative labor for all. Montana is especially desirable for women. And this is the governor of Colorado and Nevada territory saying it would be a great blessing if an emigration of females could be obtained. And, why are they trying to, why are they so worried about bringing women into the state? I think this is a unique result of what state-level politics was like in the mid and late 19th century. So the United States, if you go back to 1840, 1830, or even earlier, and try to put yourself in that frame of mind, it's not yet known that the United States is going to go from sea to shining sea. People wanted it to, but all of that territory was not yet held by the United States. It was being fought over. There were fights that were happening against indigenous populations. There were fights that were happening against Mexico, against the French. And so this quest to kind of be the government that would control all of this fertile and resourceful land was still very much a battle. And so, in order to bring a territory into the United States and have it become actually a formal member of the United States, it had to reach a certain population. So this was established by the initial contracts that, the first of these being Thomas Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase, where he articulated in that agreement with the French for them to acknowledge American control over that territory, that area had to reach a certain population before it would actually transition away from territorial status and into the more secured status of statehood. So the number of people who had to be brought in changed over time. It grew as time passed, but there was this really important motivation to try to increase population in order to secure that territory. So frontiers are almost always a man's game. So the first people to head out to a frontier at this point in time are almost always military, and then shortly after them come explorers, miners, things like that. It's only homesteaders, when homesteaders start coming later after there's more establishment in the region, that you start to get whole families that include women. So like the first census of Denver, the population was 95% men. That's a lot of dudes. And we were just talking about teaching biology to junior high students in the back. I don't know how far you all got in your own studies in this area, but you're going to need women if you want to grow population in a territory. So there was this setup that was created by political institutions and by the circumstances of frontier life that meant that these governors, who by the way were themselves ex-military and employees of the federal government, chosen directly by the president, these men were tasked for the reason of fulfilling these political objectives with getting population in this area, and that meant getting women in that area. So you see, statements being made directly by these politicians about how, important this goal is to them, but there are literally hundreds, multiple hundreds, if you go, just that I found in a week or two, looking in newspaper archives from the 19th century, of different statements by governors, editors of newspapers, who were often also very influential in small towns along the frontier. Those would have been, other important figures. And they write statements, and they get circulated around the country that to try to convince women, my territory is the best territory. If you want to move out west, you need to settle in Texas, because here you can earn $20 a month. You need to settle in Garfield County, California, because they have 1,100 unmarried men and 28 unmarried women. Go west, girls. That's not me. That's that's 1887 speaking. One of my favorites is from Fillmore City in the territory of Utah. Now, Utah had a terrible. Actually, I'm not sure the Mormons were out there yet at the time this statement was made, and I need to check on that. They get a terrible reputation later with respect to their treatment of women because of the practice of polygamy. So Utah winds up, along with Wyoming, actually being one of the first two states to allow women to vote because they are working so hard to kind of correct this perception. But anyway, so the correspondent from Utah is writing in this New York newspaper, "For humanity's sake, and a mutual benefit to the race and to both sections of the country, do, Mr. Editor, earnestly recommend the emigration from down east of a few thousand virtuous and industrious young ladies." So there's a really active conversation around which part of the country is going to be best for women to move. Again, like in the case of the expansion of economic opportunity, you want people vying for you. So the more that these different political decision makers and legal jurisdictions find it important to vie for the residency of women, they are going to be more and more motivated to create a set of laws that is going to be friendly to women's ability to prosper in this part of the country. So it winds up being, deeply impactful as those territories become more settled. And as those, particular territories are becoming closer to being able to be members of the United States, they make those changes you saw on that map, and they extend economic property rights to married women. This is just, this is just a little snippet of my proof that women could move. There were the Homestead Act after I think the first 3 or 4 years was open to women, so single women could go and take advantage of the Homestead Act. They would advertise how good the salaries were for women. Even on the, I said, 30 cents on the dollar, but even on those wages, a single woman could save up after just a few months to be able to move out west. So not only was there competition for women, but women able to take advantage of it. So we have kind of all the ingredients for this recipe to come together. All right, my third reason I want to offer for why I think so much changed about such a deeply entrenched history in the 19th century is that there were key figures who believed that economic rights were important. So competition over women and women's labor, women's residency, it's not going to lead to beneficial outcomes that protect their economic rights if that's not a valuable incentive for these women. This has to be something that those women would want and recognize to be in their interest in order for it to work as a carrot. You can't, something doesn't work as an incentive if the person you're trying to incentivize doesn't want it. All right, so the fact that these key figures believed that economic rights were important was a critical ingredient without which none of the other political and economic incentives would have been able to bring about the change that we actually observed. So we know politicians believed it. They recognized, at least some of them, they recognized that it would appeal to their voting base and to their residents if they were preeminently liberal in politics, in religion, and in social matters. So that still doesn't mean they did it just out of the goodness of their hearts. It means they recognized that it appealed to their constituency. Reformers believed it. So this is Susan B. Anthony on the far right. I know, I should try to find a younger picture of her. These are actually her parents, Daniel and Lucy Anthony. So I know it looks a little weird next to each other. But the reason why I put them up there is that Daniel Anthony operated 2 textile mills in Pennsylvania that employed these working women who were some of the first kind of pioneers to depart domestic work and take advantage of this alternative opportunity of being involved in the wage workforce. And one of the experiences, and there were other impactful experiences, but one of them that led Susan B. Anthony to her convictions about the intellectual capabilities of women and the injustice of them being denied the ability to fully take advantage of those was that she observed these working women in the mills and saw how perfectly capable they were and how competent they were, and she saw them making good decisions for themselves even when they were off on their own. And she just didn't understand how such a competent group of people could be labeled too foolish to care for themselves and in need of nurturing by others. So that along with, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't also point to her connections with the Quaker community, which especially the liberal sides of the Quaker community in the 19th century United States were huge reformers and active in abolition and in women's rights and in emancipation in general. But her witnessing of women's competence became then critical to her work that pushed through women's suffrage and also created the platform for many of the women's economic rights changes that we observed. So yeah, I think that experience, in my mind, is one of the best examples for why kind of what you see modeled can have an impact. That's one of the reasons maybe why this Women in Economics Week and things like this might be important, because what you see modeled does matter on some level. All right, and women believed it. So I just threw this one in recently. This is my girl, Hannah Mather Crocker. Almost nobody knows about her. There's like 3 academic articles written on her. A bunch of her work has not been republished since the time it was originally written. But she's actually the first American to write a treatise on women's rights. And she's writing from a Puritan religious perspective. So she says, the wise author of nature has endowed the female mind with equal powers and faculties, and given them the same right of judging and acting for themselves as he gave to the male sex. As such, women must have an equal right to enjoy all the blessings, tranquility, freedom, and peace can bestow on a free and happy people. This is, being written prior to the opening of these first factories in the United States, but in in my mind, there's no other way to interpret this but that women should be as fully capable of taking advantage of new opportunities as men. So I view this as an argument that is in defense of women's ability to fully participate in the economy and the importance of those rights. This is from a mill worker herself. And she writes, women have an indefeasible and inalienable right to buy and sell, solicit and refuse, choose and reject as have men. These propositions we are prepared to defend, and while we have mind, talent, acquisition ability, and a pen, we will defend them. So this is from the voice of these workers themselves, about their recognition of how important their ability to make their own economic decisions was. And so, most of these women were unmarried. By the time you get into the later 19th century, it was more common for occasionally some married women or some women who had been maybe abandoned but were still married to be working in these factories. So some of the mill workers write about having, women working alongside them who would jump every time the door opened because they were afraid it was their husband finally coming back, because still everything she had earned during the time that he was gone would have been his legal property. So I think the salience of the way that it impacts your ability to invest in yourself and to change your life when you don't have access to your own economic rights was clearly apparent to the women who were living in the 19th century at this time. I'm basically out of time, and I want to allow a couple questions, so I won't kind of dwell on this. I'll just say, the big takeaway from that section is that even though industrialization and political competition led to great changes in respect for women's property ownership and legal enforcement of women's property ownership, there were still battles. So there was legislation in the late 19th and early 20th century that prohibited the kinds of jobs women could do, what kind of tasks they could do while they were on the job, how long the hours were that they could work, whether or not they could work at night. This was all done in the name of trying to protect women. So this idea, this kind of fiction, which, by the way, notice that this idea of women needing to be protected from work is not being offered in 1800 when you have women carrying like the freaking cow, into the kitchen to be able to do all this curing and hard manual labor. It's only later when we start to get a wealthier society that can afford more leisure that this idea that women are weaker and needs to be protected really kind of takes hold. And so there's legislation that's put on the books designed to protect women, but actually again restricts opportunity. So it illustrates the importance of being kind of vigilant about the importance of alternatives and opportunities, and about the way that they serve as protections and as tools for people that we might not always recognize needing to be able to have those protections and use those tools. Okay, just a short word on the globe. Other countries in the modern day. Still, over a third of the countries on the planet restrict women's freedom to be able to choose where to live. This is most often in the form of passport restrictions, where married women have to get permission from their husbands to travel. Over half of countries still prohibit women from working in particular occupations, often in industry. And there are still 18 countries where husbands are legally permitted to prohibit their wives from working at all. So these things are not a relic of the past, even though we don't face them as daily struggles ourselves. There still are parts of the world where women could have alternatives that they are being legally denied for various reasons. This is estimates from the International Monetary Fund, and they find that I can't remember if this is 30 or 40 countries total, but they look at the 30 or 40 countries that are most restrictive in terms of allowing women to work and to make their own decisions. And they find that if those countries instituted gender equal policies, their GDP could go up by anywhere between 15 and 30%. 30%. A third of an entire economy is being sacrificed in some nations by virtue of not permitting women to fully utilize their skills. Okay, so I draw from this history a few lessons about how we could maybe further the rights of women around the world, but I think this applies to furthering the rights of any group. Increasing economic opportunity is important. That's what gives you those work alternatives, those keeping myself alive alternatives that women were allowed to take advantage of in American history. Maybe we need to make it easier to cross borders. I bet some of the women living under these legal restrictions might like to move to somewhere that had policies that were a little friendlier. And I have to say, one little bit of sad news about some of these changes that have been taking place and reforms in these laws is that sometimes countries reform their stated law at the level of national policy, but actual practice within communities does not change. So international pressure alone is not enough to fix these problems. You need impetus for change actually coming from within those communities. And then I would offer, it's Women in Economics Week, Women in the Economy. Maybe we're doing our little bit here to keep alive the idea that economic rights are fundamental human rights. They are critical for women and for women to be able to advance, and for any oppressed group to be able to advance. So, I don't know, hopefully some of that has captured your attention, if not your imagination. I think, that this conversation about women and opportunity is such an important one. I thank you all so much for coming out to spend an hour of your day today talking about it.